What's up? I'm happy to share with you a simple, aggressive and universal system that works across any attempts of your opponent who is playing white. Let's say your opponent goes pawn e4 or any other move, you're gonna play knight to c6. And after that, it's natural for your opponent to wish to grab the center by going pawn to d4. And it looks very advantageous for white. It seems like he's ready to go forward and he grabbed the center, but now you counter-strike with pawn to e5. Counterattacking this pawn on d4. Now, what will your opponent do? If white takes here, that's not a problem. You just recapture, you've got a centralized knight, life's good. But of course, the move that seems to be a lot more challenging is if white goes forward with pawn to d5, drives your knight away, grabs the space. And at first it looks like white is just getting a superior position here, but the reality is much trickier. This variation is so tricky that it's crazy to believe. In lots of the main lines here, you crush your opponents within the first literally 10 moves. For example, let's say your opponent goes pawn to c4, kind of playing similar to the King's Indian defense maybe, and now you reroute your knight to the king side. And it actually turns out to be a pretty good maneuver, because from here, your knight is always ready to jump forward and to join your middle game attack, or even an opening attack. Plus, you have very harmonic development for the rest of your pieces. Let's say white does something. Now you bring your bishop out either to b4 or to c5. These both squares are pretty good. From b4, it's going to pin the knight. From c5, it's going to join your possible attack against your opponent's king. And in most cases, you wish to play there because that's the most aggressive option. Now white plays something, then you bring your other knight out, and you can easily see that you've got a pretty good concentration of your forces that are ready to go forward and attack your opponent's king side. Plus, after you push this pawn forward, your light-squared bishop will also be involved into your kingside activities. Now, the fun part about this opening is that the most played move by white here loses on the spot. It's the move knight e2, which looks like white is playing very solid moves, like they keep all their pieces connected and defending each other, but the reality is right the opposite. After knight to g4, it is basically all over. It's time for white to resign. Now, what's the catch here? Well, you team up against this pawn on f2. And you're ready either to grab it by the bishop and to start attacking the king, or to grab it by the knight, and from there it's going to also fork the queen as well as this rook in the corner, and that will also be over for white. So what can white do? In most cases they'll try to castle. We'll talk about that in a second. Some of your opponents will try to defend this pawn by going rook to f1, defending it that way. But it actually is a blunder, because first off, you can just grab this pawn and attack the rook that way. But even stronger is just to go knight to h4, threatening this pawn on g2 with a check to the king. And as white pushes the pawn forward, trying to save it, here's a sneaky checkmate with knight to f3. What if your opponent tries to defend this pawn by castling? It looks like the easiest solution, but in reality, after that, you are ready to bring your queen into the attack. That's another advantage of moving your knight away from f6, and quite often you move it either to g4, as we did in this case, or in some variations, you reroute it through h5 to f4, which is also an interesting maneuver. Alright, let's get back to our stuff. So your opponent has just castled. What do you do next? Now you bring your queen out, and you add even more pressure against these two squares. And as you can see, you completely overwhelm your opponent by the sheer amount of errors and lines that I drawn here. You can see that white is in trouble. I mean, the first threat that they have to address is queen takes h2, checkmate in 1. So they gotta play pawn h3. But now you break through and you take knight takes f2. Notice that not only you grab the pawn and you attack all around, but also we've got this nasty bishop on c5, which is ready to deliver some sort of a discover check. So whenever you jump with your knight on the next move, in any direction, it's gonna deliver this discover check. And white can't tolerate it. That would be completely devastating, so they have to give up the exchange. Now you recapture, you attack the king has to go, and from here not only you have grabbed the material, but you still save your extremely powerful attack. Your queen is active, your knight is ready to join and to attack here. You can always play d6, and your bishop also starts targeting white's king side, and you can even sack it on h3 quite often and just finish the game off. But in this case, knight h4 is the most straightforward. This is a checkmate in one threat, queen takes g2, and if white defends it somehow, queen g1 or queen h1, there is another sneaky checkmate, knight f3. Notice that the pawn is pinned, and therefore you deliver this sneaky checkmate. Here's a really cool part about this system. Those of you who are part of the Igor Nation for a long time know that a long time ago I recorded actually a video about this opening, and lots of you guys enjoyed it and told me how you're crushing it with it, but many of you have also said that you don't know what to do when your opponent is playing knight f3 or going for the London system. So good news, I'm going to share with you how you can checkmate white London player in 7 moves. Literally, it's highly likely to occur. So it works across all the openings, but it works especially well against the London system, which is a bonus point for any opening. Now let's get back to our stuff and stick around. I'll show you how to crush the London system in a moment. Anyway, let's start with either pawn e4 or pawn d4, doesn't matter. You go with knight to c6. He goes pawn e4, pawn e5. Now we reach this position. Most of your opponents will push the pawn forward because it looks really good for white. Now you bring your knight over to the king side, and we have talked about the move pawn c4, which looks kind of natural. But what if your opponent doesn't play it and plays some other development move? Guess what? Nothing changes for you. You play all the same moves once again. So you continue your journey to the king side. From here it guards this pawn on e5, plus in the future you're ready to go forward and attack. Now let's say your opponent plays some move, let's say knight to c3, you also develop your knight. And we know that on the next move we're going to develop this bishop, either to b4 or to c5. By the way, let me also just share a couple generalities so that you understand the system, because it is really just a setup, it is a system. You don't have to memorize the moves. If you understand the logic behind these moves, you can play them regardless of your opponent's choice. So let's say your opponent plays some natural, or a little bit passive move. What are you going to do then? Well, you do wish to develop this bishop somehow. Because if not, at some point you'll wish to bring this bishop out, the queenside bishop. And as you play d6, you will enable the diagonal for this bishop, but the dark squared bishop will be really depressed, and you don't want that, right? So you want to bring the bishop out first, before you lock the pawn chain. Sometimes you can go bishop b4 and pin the knight, create some pressure along this diagonal, which will also make this pawn on e4 vulnerable, because you pinned the knight who is defending the pawn currently. So in this case, that would be a pretty cool move to play. In other cases, you wish to bring your bishop to c4, to c5, because it's going to support your kingside attack. All right, now let's get it back. The most common move in this position by white is actually bishop g5, which is standard in other openings, but completely unsound in the particular situation. Because after you go pawn h6, here's the interesting part. Your opponent can't go bishop h4 as they usually do it, because your knight from g6 actually is controlling this square. So that's a funny part about this knight on g6. And it means that bishop g5 move becomes just completely useless for white. By the way, after bishop h4, it's not only just an exchange of a bishop, but after that you have a little tactics knight takes e4, which is a discovered attack of this knight. And you get basically a winning advantage, even though of course it's not a checkmate yet, but anyway, you have a really good position here. So let's take it back. Now, in most cases, your opponents will realize that bishop g5 was kind of useless. They don't want to go back, so they will trade on f6, which is great, because bishop, generally speaking, is a little bit stronger than a knight. Plus, now you bring your queen out, which will also favor your kingside attack. And for lack of the dark square bishop, your opponent won't be able to ever trade off your knight. As soon as you land it there, your opponent won't be able to capture it because he's got no bishop anymore, which means that white's going to be in trouble. So let's say white develops. Again, you bring your dark square bishop out, white castles, you go d6 to open up this bishop. And you can already see how much you have this strong concentration of forces against his kingside. So quite often you can finish it off within a couple of moves, really, just because your position is so strong there. Let's say they go a3. Now you can bring your knight forward to f4. Sometimes you can also bring the bishop over here and pin the knight. And as let's say they go b4 to attack your bishop. And of course you could just drop it back, that would be perfectly fine. But in this case your position is so strong that you're ready to go for the kill. And a typical combo here would be to play bishop h3. You want to open up your opponent's king and to checkmate it along the g-file. For example, if white captures your bishop over here, then you do capture that pawn with the bishop, and then you play queen g6 and you deliver that checkmate. If white captures the bishop themselves, then you don't have to recapture, you just go in for this checkmate. Check to the king, king goes, queen g2, checkmate. Here comes the fun part. There is no way out for your opponent. Let's say your opponent goes e4 or d4 or knight to f3, doesn't matter. Let's say d4, you go knight to c6. Now, if your opponent goes for e4, after e5, it transposes into the position that we want. Now, let's try something else for white. What if your opponent goes pawn to c4? guess what? You're playing the same move, pawn to e5. You still attack this pawn. If they capture on e5, good for you. You just traded his central pawn and you end up with a good position. If white pushes the pawn forward, you reroute your knight to the king side and we are getting the very same position. Let's say your opponent is really stubborn and really does not want to let you play your opening system. Let's say white goes knight to f3 here, and it looks like there is no e5 at all for you anymore because white is controlling the square so much. Indeed, you can't go e5 right away, but you can play d6 first, preparing to go either e5 on the next move or maybe bishop g4 first in order to put pressure against this knight. Now, if your opponent goes c4, as they often do it in the Queen's Gambit and other similar openings, you've got a choice here and you can play e5 still. Now, if white captures here on e5, you can either recapture with a knight and just trade off everything, going into an equal endgame. That's a possible opportunity for black. The option that I like more, especially for blitz, is going bishop g4, where you're playing in the Gambit style. You're willing to give up one pawn for the sake of quick development. Now you're ready to play queen e7, castle queenside, put your rook against his queen, and it gives you a lot of initiative. Again, works really well, especially in blitz, because your opponent doesn't know what to do and you've got this quick and easy attack. I've got another video about this particular opening variation, and if you'd like to know it, then after watching this video, you may check it out. The link will be in the description below the video. Alright, how do you deal with the London system? So white goes knight f3, and after you remove pawn to d6, they play bishop f4. Now go on e5, indeed is not possible, they'll be able to capture it and win a pawn, but you can play bishop g4 first. And quite often as you develop your bishop either to g4 or to f5, in both cases, it somewhat interferes with your opponent's plans, and London system players are usually confused. Anyway, right now they'll see that you're putting pressure and they'll play their standard move pawn to e3 as they wish to build this pyramid of pawns. Now you strike in the center with the move pawn to e5. And that already feels annoying because you attack the bishop and also you possibly can push this pawn forward, targeting this knight which is being down to the queen. Now white wants to trade here on e5. Now at this point they realize that you are ready to take on d1 and force their king to move, to be centralized and exposed, so they trade on d8 themselves. Alright, now your opponent starts thinking what to do, and they realize that if they calculate the attackers and defenders, they've got two attackers against only one defender, and they realize that they can pick up a pawn and win. So they happily grab your pawn, and let's not forget that your opponent doesn't know that you are prepared. Your opponent still thinks that you're playing some weird opening moves and you don't know what you're doing. So after knight takes e5, they think that he takes, I take, I'm up a pawn, I'm good, but the reality is rook d1 is a checkmate. Even if your opponent doesn't fall for this trap, you still have a superior position. You're attacking this bishop over here, you can push the pawn forward and chase away the knight. Your other knight is ready to jump here to b4, threatening this pawn on c2 with a fork. You've got a lot here, and white needs to be really careful to save their position. Here's the cherry on the cake. I've told you that it's a universal opening that you can use as black against virtually any move of your opponent. However, you can also use the very same opening system as white, having all the same advantages and an extra tempo on top of it, which makes it even more dangerous. Therefore, if you're interested, stay tuned. I'm gonna publish a video about that somewhere in the near future. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the bell to not miss out on the continuation. Have a great rest of the day, and I'll talk to you soon.